This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On June the 2nd, 2016, the RCMI hosted the annual D-Day Dodgers Luncheon in honor of the veterans and fallen of the Italian campaign. Writer and TV producer Larry Rose delivered a deeply moving portrait of a young Canadian pilot who flew with the RAF and died in the final days of the war.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a real honor to be here. Adrian mentioned that I'd spent a lot of years in broadcasting, and I don't know how many people here remember Harvey Kirk, the CTV anchor. Well, at CTV, people would ask you, how long have you been here? And people would say, oh, well, I've been here, 5 years after Lloyd arrived, or they'd measure it in some other way. They did 2 years after we had the new set. I used to measure the time that I'd been at CTV. People would say, well, when did you start at CTV? I'd say, well, Harvey Kirk just left, but there was still a hole in the wall where he threw the typewriter through. I'm very happy to be here among you today, and I wonder if I could just briefly mention that there are a couple of distinguished journalists here as my guests. And one of them, just right over here, is Dennis McIntosh, who was Vice President of CTV News. And Dennis was one of the first hosts of Canada AM, an early reporter for CTV News in China. But his main job all the years that I was at CTV was writing herd on Lloyd Robertson. So Dennis McIntosh is right here. If you could just also the Peter Moon, retired Globe and Mail reporter, is here as well today. Peter is still active in the reserves with the Canadian Rangers. So welcome to Peter, who's also dead. This week, I don't know if you've seen, Mr. Trump has really been trashing journalists in the United States. So I think our occupation needs a little recognition. I was watching CNN last night, and one of the analysts there said that she wasn't a bit surprised that Mr. Trump is trashing journalists because in the recent U.S. polls, they were showing that journalists were rating lower than politicians in public approval, which is pretty hard to do. And I think that pretty much only leaves jihadists and convicted murderers below. So, well, journalists need all the reinforcement and recognition we can get, I think. I'm here today to talk about a fighter pilot in the Italian campaign. I'm going to speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then if there are people who have questions or comments or reminiscences, I very much welcome that, and welcome your contribution and have a little discussion once I'm finished. I'm going to talk about the broader picture of the Italian campaign and the air campaign in Italy a bit later. But mostly I'm here to start to talk about one member of the Royal Canadian Air Force, Flying Officer Robert Mole English. And he is the person, as Adrian mentioned, the person in the title of the presentation, a fighter pilot in the Italian campaign. As was mentioned in the promotional material, he died right at the end of the Second World War on April 18th, 1945. He was flying a Spitfire 9 near Spezia on the west coast of Italy. He was a member of number 208 Squadron RAF. On the lower right there, you'll see a Spitfire 9. The prefix RG was the 208 Squadron prefix. The last letter in each aircraft was different, so I don't know the last letter of his aircraft. But that's very similar to the one that he was flying. Above the aircraft is the 208 Squadron crest, and of course that's the long crown. It should be the Tudor crown, but it's the Imperial crown. I couldn't find a representation of 208 Squadron with a Tudor crown in it. But in any event, that's the squadron logo. It has a pyramid, or it has a sphinx in the middle, because the squadron had been based in Egypt since before the Second World War. It actually dated back to the First World War. And I should mention that Robert was in an RAF squadron, but in reality, there were more Canadians and more Royal Canadian Air Force members serving in RAF squadrons than there were in the RCAF. Most of the graduates of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan were streamed into RAF squadrons, and that's exactly what happened to Robert. There was virtually no RAF squadrons that didn't have at least one Canadian pilot in them. Most of the bomber crews were mixed, but they often had Canadian aircrew mixed into the RAF bomber squadrons. I've indicated with a little red arrow there where Spezia is. This is just on the west coast, just north of the Gothic line near Pisa. So this is roughly where Robert was in the spring of 1945. This is Robert. He was born in St. Catharines, Ontario. He's about 5'9", as you can tell. He's around 140 pounds, so he's pretty much my size. He was an outgoing individual. He was confident. If he walked into a room like this, I'm sure he would have no problems meeting people. He's a bright individual, not a braggart, very sincere and thoughtful. His family was close. He was an only child, and the church was very much a part of his life. So how do I know this? How do we know what Robert English was really like? Well, for one thing, the family has allowed me to look through 75 letters that he wrote home from the time he joined the RCAF until just shortly before he died. And the letters portray an individual who changes very quickly. The first letters were shortly after he enlisted, and you can see he's every bit a teenager. He was just 18 when he joined up, and we forget today how young many of these people were. I mean, I'm sure some parents today worry about the kids having a driver's license at 17. Well, these people are flying Spitfires in combat at 18 and 19. So his first letters show him as a kind of a teenager. He says, he writes home shortly after he enlisted, I met a girl in Toronto, don't laugh. Another one he says, it's payday, boy oh boy. But that changes very, very quickly. And if you read the letters in succession, you can see how very quickly many of these young people who were enrolled in the RCF at that time, same with the Army and Navy, they matured almost overnight. And I remember hearing someone who's a fighter pilot commenting that he grew up in one day almost. The first day you're in combat is, the teenage days are gone forever. So these are very young people, but at the same time, they've had a breadth of experience that's hard for us to imagine today. The letters show that Robert writes very good, clear grammatical English, but he's a Canadian through and through. A number of times he ends his sentences with "eh." In one of them he says, "a bit of luck, eh?" And that rather surprised me. I thought that was kind of a contemporary thing. I thought people did that today. You know, you're going to go downtown and have a beer, eh? But actually his letters have that all the way through, which I think is kind of charming and quite unexpected. Among the letters, there's one from one of Bob's friends written to Mrs. English, his mother, and he gives a description of Bob. So we have Robert's own letters, we have letters about him, and there's one letter in there from his mother to Robert. I should say, in a poignant kind of way, there was one letter that wasn't opened among these 75 letters, and I decided not to open it either. It's the letter that was returned to his mother. It was a letter from her to him. It was returned to her on his death, unopened. And it's marked "Return to Family" on it. And I had the letter, but I decided not to open it. So I honestly don't know what's in the last letter that she wrote. As soon as Robert turned 18, he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. And so, in addition to the letters, we have his, some of his personal file, which I got from Library and Archives Canada. If someone from the Second World War has died, you can write and get their service record. They don't send you the whole thing, they just send you parts of it. But this, for instance, is the attestation paper that he signed. It basically means, who are you? It's the person saying who they are. So there's no doubt about the identification of who they are. I think this particular one, and this is just half of the first page, but I think it's kind of fun because on the left-hand side there you see the phone number, JU8941. I believe that's Jubilee, is it not? The prefix, does anybody remember the old prefix numbers in? Junction. Oh, is that what it is? Okay, Junction. I didn't know. I just took a guess, and it might be Jubilee. I remember when I was a kid, our phone number at my folks had a retail business, and our phone number at the store was 642. So we kind of forget today how much it's changed. So I got to be a kick out of the fact that the phone number was quite a bit different than we would expect today. Also, it lists on there his present address. Mount Dennis, Ontario. I had no idea where Mount Dennis, Ontario was. Ever heard of it? Yeah? I didn't have a clue. But of course it's in the West End and it's now just been absorbed by Toronto, but I didn't know where Mount Dennis was. So there's all kinds of interesting little tidbits about the times, about Robert, and so on. But it also includes further down off the page, I didn't put it in here, but it has some comments written by an officer who interviewed him. It's an entrance interview. And this officer describes Robert as just 18, assertive and well-organized, slender build, frank, sincere, promising material. So I thought that was the kind of, that was this guy's first impression. I thought it was very interesting and warm kind of summary of what he would have been like if you'd met him. Now I should mention here that on enlistment, Robert applied for aircrew. The people applying for aircrew, the vetting process was very elaborate. And the reason was there were hundreds and hundreds of people who wanted to be Air Force pilots, and they had to start vetting them very, very quickly. So on entrance, they were given a whole bunch of tests on academic subjects to find out their academic standing. But also, they were given psychological tests, and they had to have an interview with a psychiatrist. And I'll just read a paragraph here from a book called Wings for Victory by Spencer Dunmore. Some of you will perhaps recognize it, about the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. The author here says, Norman Shrive recalls that one part of the process at number 1 initial training school in Toronto was a visit to the psychiatrist, a word that in 1942 still had connotations of voodoo and witchcraft. Shrive was lucky. As he entered the psychiatrist's office, a friend was just leaving. Passing Shrive, he whispered, "Get on the bus, for God's sakes." Puzzled, Shrive went in to see the psychiatrist. Within a few minutes, the meaning of his friend's cryptic message became clear. The shrink asked Shrive if he pressed his trousers before going on a date. Shrive said yes. After walking to the bus stop, the bus in sight, did you ever say to yourself, "Oh God, did I remember to unplug the iron?" "Yes, sir." "What did you do?" Shrive writes, "Well, no matter what I really would have done, I gave the required answer. I'd get on the bus." And so he was accepted. But what that had to do with being a pilot, I haven't the faintest idea. But it does give a kind of a notion of some of the elaborate testing that went on to become a pilot. Now, in addition to the military records here, we also have, I talked to this lady. Now, this is Robert's cousin. Her name is Gert Penrell. She's 93 years old. She lives in Mississauga, and she remembers Robert very well. And that's a picture of him as a teenager that she's holding. And so Mrs. Penwell's son, Grant, actually has all of Robert's letters. So she is, Mrs. Penwell is a sister of Robert's mother. Her maiden name is Moore. So from all this, from the letters, from the military records, from Mrs. Penwell and other sources, we can get a pretty good picture of what kind of person Robert was really like. She described him as outgoing and a great lad. Now, Bob's parents, Bob's father couldn't get work in St. Catharines, so they only lived there for a few years. Here he is about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years old, I don't know exactly how old. They lived in St. Catharines for a few years, but his father was a tradesman and I think had family connections in New Jersey, so the family actually moved to New Jersey to where he went, had most of his education. And this is him about 14 or 15, I guess. Now this is one of these black and white photographs that's been hand painted. Do any of you have any of those at home? I have one from when I was a baby. It's a black and white picture. An artist, Eric, you have one? You have an artist comes along and paints it by hand. And this is an amazing, I think the artist, whoever he was, did an amazing job on this picture. But they never quite get the lips right or the eyes right. They always turn out just a little bit too red and the eyes are just a little too blue. But I thought that was an amazing picture for black and white. You would never have been able to get a color photograph in those days. So anyway, this is him when he's 14. This is him just after. Obviously, he has his wings on, so this is not too long after he enlisted. So he joined up in September 1943. He did his early training here at Marshall McLuhan School on Eglinton Avenue Road. But of course, it wasn't Marshall McLuhan School then. That's just where the location is today. At that time, it was the original location of the Hunt Club. And in 1939, the government bought the property of the Hunt Club, and when Robert was a cadet, it was an RCF initial training base. So he did 4 weeks of training there. I should mention, as a complete aside, also at the Hunt Club about that same time was Dr. Fred Banting on one of the most secret military programs in Canadian history. Dr. Banting headed a program that was conducted at the Hunt Club to develop the world's first anti-G suit, the first flying suit to protect fighter pilots doing steep maneuvers from blacking out. That research was done right at the Hunt Club, and it was successful. And in time, they developed the first anti-G suit for fighter pilots. So they moved Dr. Banting and his crew over to one side, and the cadets all came in. Robert was passed that course, and he went to initial flying training. That was done in Oshawa, and he was flying the plane on the left there, the Tiger Moth. And that was a standard trainer in late 1930s and through the war. It was a British aircraft, a British design. The Canadian modification was to put that little canopy on it so you didn't freeze to death while you were flying in the winter. I talked to one pilot who flew it and who's flown the aircraft, and he said it's actually a pretty sturdy little aircraft. It looks very petite and very likely to blow over in a strong wind, but he said it's actually fairly sturdy. And I would think if hundreds of novice pilots are flying it, then it would have to be pretty rugged. After he graduated from there, and again, there would have been quite a few people wash out on basic flying training, initial flying training. He graduated to the Harvard, and he described it in a letter home. He said, "What a ship, really lovely, but it's no toy." And I think anyone who's flown that aircraft, I don't know, have you flown one, Gary?
No, but I know a lot about
Yeah.
it. I haven't flown.
They're not easy aircraft to fly. For one thing, they're big aircraft. They're meant to be as big as the contemporary fighters, had retractable gear and so on. And so this was this is a big step up from a Tiger Moth.
If you could fly that You could fly into a line fighter.
Yeah,
Without an instructor, because they were single cockpit.
Yes. They're a big aircraft, and there's still lots of them around today. I read something just a couple of days ago that as recently as 1992, there were still a couple of air forces that were using it as a training aircraft. The South African Air Force was still flying Harvards in 1992. During one of Robert's training sessions, one of his student pilots was killed. And he doesn't give details in the letter, but he said, the CO gave us quite a talk. This must have been a very sobering moment for young pilots and aspiring pilots to all of a sudden have one of their classmates killed in a plane crash. And you can see that's one of the moments where the tone of his letters all changed. But the reality is there were like 1,000 fatal accidents in the BC British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. And there were not only 1,000 people killed in flying accidents, but there were that many killed up to the DEAT period in 42. So there were a great many accidents. Some of them were foolish, some of them they were fooling around. But in other cases, it's mechanical failure or bad navigation or a whole history of other causes. But it was a very dangerous occupation trying to learn to be a pilot in wartime conditions because everything was so compressed. Robert was awarded his pilot wings on August 20th, 1943, and was posted overseas almost immediately. He went overseas October 12th, 1943. It's a little different picture, eh? He looks a little different there. So he arrived in Britain, he arrived at Bournemouth, where all kinds of Canadian airmen are arriving, and soldiers, and they didn't have jobs for them right away. So they sent them on leave. They were able to tour around London, see the sights, and but he very quickly got bored. He wrote a letter home that said, "Nice quiet life, so quiet in fact, I'm going nuts. I'm about to go nuts. We're eager to get flying again." So you can imagine the war's going full blast. Historic events are unfolding right in front of them. And here they are, stranded in England, not able to do anything. They're just putting in time. Robert spent the first 2 Christmases away from home, and you can tell from the tone of the letters, this was a very bleak time for him. And it must have been a very bleak time for many Canadian soldiers overseas to be away from home from the very first time. So you can tell the tone of his letters. He said he was doing okay, but at one point he said they started singing Christmas carols, and that was almost too much for him. His family was being missed, and he was a long way from home. Then on June 27th, 1944, a letter he sent home was postmarked Egypt. At this time, he was promoted from pilot officer to flying officer. I should mention, by the way, that graduates from the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, about 2/3 of them were sergeant pilots. It was only those who finished near the top of the class who were made pilot officers, and Robert was one of them. So that's a further indication that he must have been a quite outstanding pilot to be commissioned at that stage and then promoted as a flying officer. He says he spent the letters home, he spent time in Egypt and Palestine, but it's not clear from the records exactly what he was doing, and it was hard to write home to give specifics about what was going on. He also spent a short time in Syria, and he talks about swimming in the Mediterranean, but it's all a bit of a mystery as exactly what his role was. So this is late 1944 now. Bob is about to head to Italy, but I want to stop here at this point before we see what he's going into, to go back a year or so and fill in some background about what was going on in Italy at that time. So this is about the Italian campaign itself. So this is Pacino Beach in Sicily, July 10th, 1943. The 1st Canadian Division and the 1st Armored Brigade, about 15,000 Canadians in all, landed here at Pacino Beach. It was a very windswept day, and the landing craft there had a terrible time getting to shore. They landed one entire battalion miles off course, and the 2 battalions had to cross over the next day to get into the correct positions. It may also have been that that there was some inexperience involved. But fortunately for the Canadians landing there in 1943, the opposition wasn't very great. There were a few Italian forces on the beach. They fired a few token shots, but basically gave up very quickly, and the Germans were further inland. So you have British, Canadian, American troops all landing in Sicily in 1943. The landing itself for Operation Husky was larger than D-Day on the first day. There were more troops went ashore in Sicily on the first day than went ashore on D-Day. So it was a big operation. It was a very large landing force that took place on the beaches in Sicily. This was the first sustained campaign of the war for the Canadian Army. There had been Dieppe, there had been Hong Kong, and there was a few days in France in 1940 where the Canadian Army fought, but this was the first long campaign. So the Canadians, when they landed at Puccino Beach, not only faced the Germans, but the blasting heat of summer. This is July 1943, Sicily, so we're talking temperatures in the mid-30s and higher. The misfortune of, or one of the misfortunes of the Canadians landing there was that the two ships carrying all their trucks were sunk. So they landed without any kind of transport of any kind, or very little. They finally borrowed some vehicles from the British alongside them. This was part of the 8th Army. But a lot of the supplies, the ammunition, everything else had to be humped up by foot or by mule to the forces as they went inland. So this was a huge disadvantage. Also, Sicily is shaped a bit like a pyramid, a low pyramid. Everything goes up toward the center from the beaches. So the Canadians, in 35-degree temperature, short of water, short of supplies, with no land cover, are going straight up facing experienced, determined German troops firing straight down. So this was a very, very difficult campaign, and there were many casualties among Canadians as a result. One of the things they ended up doing a fair amount of was doing night operations to try and counteract the advantage the Germans had of being able to see them whenever they moved. I should mention just by the way that there were RCAF aircraft involved in the Husky operation. 331 wing consisted of 3 squadrons, a 424 squadron, 420 squadron, and 427 squadron. They were doing mainly medium bombing operations. And again, I've got the wrong crown there, sorry. The middle crown is the correct crown, the Tudor crown. So there were RCF members who took part in Operation Husky. Some of the landing craft were manned by Royal Canadian Navy Volunteer Reserves. This is the Puccino Beach a few years ago. It's like 5 years ago, I think. And I find visiting battlefield sites today to be a really kind of strange experience. This is the exact same area that we just saw in the earlier picture, and yet it looks so benign. You know, there are houses there, just off in the corner here, there are beach umbrellas and ladies in bikinis, everybody's throwing beach balls around. And I just find it hard to imagine that same spot in 1943 was the center of the landing operation. Puccino, by the way, is just, if you look at the small map in the top left, it's just at the bottom of that highlighted red area. I presume that's a district or county or something. That's where Puccino Beach is. In our tour, we went up to the center of the island, which is pretty much Ajira, and we had a memorial service there. Yeah, that's General Thompson, his wife, and on back here is Colonel Alan Neff then, and we're laying a wreath at the Ajira Cemetery. There are 490 graves at Ajira Cemetery, so the cost for the Canadians was very, very high. 13 of those were members of the Royal Canadian Air Force. And this is not the only cemetery, but I think it was a very touching, very moving thing to be able to pay tribute to these fallen Canadians at this cemetery. So on November 1st, 1944, Robert reported to his family, "Your son is in Italy." So I'd just like to go over a little bit here, a map where we are. So he landed in Italy in October 1944, posted to number 208 Squadron. The Canadian Corps was where the red arrow is on the right-hand side. The Canadian Corps was south of the Gothic line. The hope of the Allies had been that in 1944, this was kind of the last line of defense, right? Just north of the Gothic line is the Po River Valley, and so this is the last geographic barrier in Italy until you get to the Alps. So the hope in 1944 was that the Allies could push right over the Gothic line and go into the Po River, and if they had done that, it might have had a dramatic effect on the outcome of the war, because they would have had access to Vienna. And Winston Churchill always said, you know, the Italian soft underbelly, well, of course, it was anything but soft, but if they had been able to get there to Vienna or close to it in 1944, imagine how post-war Europe, how different it might have looked. So this was an extremely important development. But in the event, the forces were not able, the weather turned bad in the fall before they were able to get that final push going. But the Canadians were up there south of Rimini, and with the 8th Army. The 8th Army was on the Adriatic coast. The US 5th Army was on the west coast. And the two of them were trying to go up the Italian peninsula. By the way, for whatever it's worth, when it comes to attacking Italy, you know, starting at the south end is the most impossible kind of way to do it. Napoleon said Italy is like a boot. You have to put your foot in at the top. But the Allies never had that option. You know, they didn't have any choice in the matter. So every few miles there would be another river that they would have to cross with flowing bridges and mountains and so on. So it was a very, very difficult campaign to try and pick the Germans out of Italy altogether. So Robert landed near Naples. They flew their aircraft over, I believe, from Egypt. They landed in Naples and then moved up to the point where they're somewhat south of Florence. The Squadron 208 Squadron was flying 500 reconnaissance and ground attack sorties a month. So they're going all day, every day that the weather's good. And by this time, I should say that a bit more on the air campaign, that the German Air Force was not a factor. There weren't a lot of air-to-air gun battles, right? Because the fighter aircraft, the German fighter aircraft, had been pushed out of Italy even before Husky. So Italy quickly became a big bomber base. And the US Army Air Force very quickly operated 2,000 heavy bombers from Italy, attacking Vienna and southern German points. And then in some missions, they go right on to Russia, landing behind the German lines, and then fly back the next day. But the main point of the attacks was to get the Romanian oil fields. The Romanian oil fields were a big target for these 2,000 US aircraft. The British were flying one group of bombers, and that was about 14 squadrons or so, and there was one Canadian squadron. So this is a rather remarkable picture. It's just obviously taken a few years ago, but you can see the US aircraft involved in the Italian campaign. At the bottom, the B-24, and well, we think of the B-17, which is just above it there, as the iconic US aircraft of the war. In fact, there were more B-24s produced than there were B-17s. And the B-24s were produced at the famous Willow Run Ford plant in Michigan, in which they had a production line that was a mile long, and they were producing B-24s by the hour once it got going. It took them a long time to set it up, but once it got going, and Henry Ford was the person who designed this thing in the first place, they were turning B-24s out by the hour. So there were more B-24s produced than B-17s. Also, the photograph, well, as remarkable as it is to get these 4 aircraft in one photo, it is a bit deceptive because it makes the B-17 look quite a bit smaller. But it was, I think, a bit smaller, but not like that. And then the top aircraft is a B-24 and a Mustang fighter. So those are the principal aircraft being used by the U.S. Air Force in the Italian campaign. The British, through Whitby's Wellington bombers on the upper right there, they were subsequently replaced by B-24s. And to my knowledge, there were no Lancasters used by the British in Italy. And the fighter aircraft, of course, were all Spitfires. So it gives you a bit of an idea of what the air campaign involved. I should mention, just parenthetically here, that the Germans didn't have many fighter aircraft. They had some based on the Dalmatian coast, and they would do hit-and-run raids every now and again. The commander was von Richthofen, the cousin of the Red Baron. He was the commander of the German forces in Italy for much of the time there. And his name is Wolfram von Richthofen. And he was a very tough cookie, apparently a real screamer, loud, brash, but also a very effective leader. What he commanded was not so much an air force as it was the anti-aircraft forces. Many of the Luftwaffe manned the anti-aircraft guns on the ground. So the Luftwaffe still did have a big role to play, even though they didn't have fighter aircraft up every day. The Germans were contesting every foot of the ground in Italy, and pouring troops and resources into the country. Northern Italy in particular was crucial to the German economy. The Germans needed the industries based in Turin and Milan with the enormous agricultural output of the Po Valley. All that fresh produce from all over the Po Valley, which is one of the richest agricultural regions in the world, was all going back to Germany because Germany was being pummeled by bombs and a lot of their production was disrupted. Bill Olmsted, an outstanding Canadian Spitfire pilot, commented on the German anti-aircraft fire earlier on. He said, at times it was so heavy that it would virtually create a cloud over the defended area. He said the pilot's expression, the flag was so heavy you could walk on it, was true. It was sometimes referred to as a steel rain rising. So if you were a pilot flying along on a Spitfire, aiming at a certain target, you would see this curtain rising in front of you of anti-aircraft fire, any one explosion of which could bring your plane down. So the German anti-aircraft fire was ferocious. From mid-April, Bob English, as part of 208 Squadron, based in the Florence area, it was operating in support of the 5th Army on the ground, often doing artillery spotting or ground strafing. They were kind of in the middle of the island, and they could go to the east and support the 8th Army, or go to the west and support the U.S. 5th Army. But the squadron was flying every single day, and Bob English was on missions frequently. I don't have particular days, but he had done, by March 25th, he had done 35 sorties. So I think by mid-April, he'd probably done about 50. His last letter home was written on March 25th, 1945. All these letters were signed, "Your loving son." So it must have been very touching, each one of these, when the family got them. These are actual pictures. These next 3 or 4 pictures are actual pictures of 208 Squadron flying in the spring of 1945. And you can see the aircraft there is very similar to the one that I described earlier. The RG is the squadron prefix, and each plane would have a different letter as the 3rd letter. There's another one here. You can see they're operating off those corrugated runways. Here's a better shot of it here. I'm sorry, I don't know who that officer is. But they could move from point to point to point. And basically, they could be going in 2 days come in one day with bulldozers and you just level the whole piece of ground. The engineers come in with the corrugated sections of landing metal, put them down in sections, and the whole thing is ready to go in one day. And so they were able to move the squadrons around very readily and very quickly all through the Italian campaign as to keep up with the front line of soldiers. Here's another, this looks like they're starting the aircraft, right? That's what it looks like to me. I'm not a pilot, but it looks to me like they're using an electric starter to get the engine going. Now, we come to the April 1945. On April 9th, 208 Squadron put its aircraft into the air near the Senio River. On April 14th, the 5th Army began its big spring push. Both the 8th Army and the 5th Army, this was what they had been waiting for. This was going to be the final big push, get the Germans, kick the Germans right out to the Alps, and that a full-scale, full-out, hell-bent for leather attack was launched on the 14th. Now, La Spezia, as you can see, this is a picture of a couple of German Navy officers taken earlier. You can see Spezia is, it's not a small place. It's a built-up town, and Robert was flying just north of there. This picture on the left is the U.S. 10th Mountain Division. It was one of the divisions in the 5th Army that was fighting in that area. It gives you a little bit of an idea there of the terrain. I should mention that the immediate U.S. troops nearest 208 Squadron were the 92nd U.S. Infantry Division, almost entirely made up of black soldiers. The only division in the U.S. Army in the Second World War, to my knowledge, made up of black soldiers, I assume with white officers. They were known as the Buffalo Soldiers. So they were just to the north, and they had quite a good record of achievement there, despite the fact they didn't have a lot of experience. It's a virtual certainty that Bob's aircraft was brought down by ground fire just north of Spezia. The squadron history reports that 3 aircraft did not return to base and simply states that the pilots are missing. Robert's parents were informed of that, but for some time they did not know his fate. In fact, I don't have the actual letter informing them that Robert had died. As far as Robert's records show, or the family knew, it's not clear what happened. However, in Bob's file is a report of an investigation done by the Royal Air Force in 1948. Why they waited to 1948, I don't know. But it's an investigation into his death and that of another pilot. I must say one of the difficulties in doing this kind of research is that sometimes you turn up things that are unexpected or distressing. The 1948 report says definitively that 2 of the pilots, including Robert, survived the crash of their respective aircraft. Robert was taken to a nearby jail for a time. However, within 2 days, he and one other pilot shot down that day, and an Italian officer were taken out and killed. Who did it, why they did it, is not clear. It remains a mystery. Very likely, it was retreating German troops who would have had difficulty bringing prisoners of war with them. It's also possible it was the SS, who were killing a lot of people near the front lines, including German soldiers who looked like they were withdrawing too early. And there were also Italian fascist partisans in the area. But I think it's most likely it was the German troops. Bob English was only 20 years old. There's the investigation. It says the bodies of 2 unknown Canadian airmen shot on April 18th were found in the civil cemetery at Stasio. He was later reburied in a military cemetery. Now, I don't want to stop there, however. I do want to make some points about the campaign in general. I think it's important, not least of all, to honor Bob English's memory, that we consider some other points. Contrary to accepted wisdom that the Eastern Front basically won the war, historian Williamson Murray notes that in July 1943, while the Battle of Kursk was underway in Russia, the Mediterranean still absorbed more German resources than the East did. As late as 1945, the Germans still had 499,000 men in the Mediterranean, exclusive of Greece. So I think it's fair to say about all those who took part in the Italian campaign, the D-Day Dodgers, their contribution to Allied victory has not always been acknowledged in full measure. Robert English was one of 5,399 Canadians who died in the Italian campaign, a campaign that lasted twice as long as the advance from D-Day to the end of the war, and we forget that. A letter written home by U.S. Army Air Force officer Jack Lundberg before his death said, "I feel that in some small way, I am helping to bring this wasteful war to a conclusion." I think that's all that most of those who were involved in the Second World War asked. And I think that's probably all Bob English would have asked. This is the Florence Commonwealth Cemetery where Bob English is buried. There are 1,600 graves here. Each one of those headstones represents the lost hopes and dreams of a young man, and family, and friends. What might they have achieved in this life? I sometimes imagine that somehow if each one of those individuals could rise and stand up beside his tombstone, we would have a real picture of what the cost of all this really was. There would be the people with their hopes and dreams smashed. I think it's just an incredible thing to be able to look at this picture and see all those tombstones. What I've tried to do here today is just pick one of those men in this cemetery, one tombstone, and talk about him. And in a way, I hope he represents all the rest. 71 years have passed, but those who died in Italy still speak to us. They live on in the freedoms we enjoy today. As author Eric Regier said in a D-Day Dodgers address here at the RCMI just a few years ago, quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that our beliefs, aspirations, values, and principles have meaning today only because men, once young and eager to embark on their own lives, put aside their hopes and ambitions to confront an enemy whose malignant aims, if achieved, would have imposed a hellish new order on millions of people." Today we did meet, even if briefly, a fine young man, a great credit to his family, his community, his country. Bob English rests today in the Florence War Cemetery surrounded by so many other young men. Here and in other cemeteries are the men of Ezura, the Sangro River, Ortona, Casino, the Gothic Line, and many more. Of the 92,000 Canadians who served in the Italian campaign, 1/3 became casualties. It's just hard to believe. As the D-Day Dodgers song says, "Look around the mountains, through the mud and rain, you'll find the battered crosses, some which bear no name." On the occasion of this luncheon, it's fitting that we pay tribute to Bob and all those who fought in the Italian campaign. Thank you, Flying Officer Robert Mould English, a boy from St. Kitts, a fighter pilot in the Italian campaign, and thank you, D-Day Dodgers.
Are we ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Here's the D-Day Dodgers, all the sea. They are drivers and their tanks. We know them.
This has been another in the ongoing series of podcasts brought to you as an educational service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. You can keep abreast of our web offerings as well as our live events by visiting our website at www.rcmi.org. Once again, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for being with us and good night.